Hello, everyone. It's Friday, so we're having a Friday fireside chat. You probably know me. I'm Rita McGrath. And just for your edification, this is being recorded, so don't say anything or type anything you don't want your grandmother finding out about. My guest this week is a dear friend of mine for a long, long time. We sort of grew up in the same academic circles, not doing the same stuff, but in the same circles, is Ron Adner. He's currently a professor at Dartmouth. In the past, he's been at INSEAD and a number of other really exciting places. And he has a brand new book out called Winning the Right Game, which I just sort of speed read my way through as I was getting ready for this, but it's full of little dog ears and TikToks and everything. And it's a great book. And so, Ron, welcome.
Well, thank you, Rita. It's great to see you.
Good to see you. So I thought, the book is really about a strategy for how to think about ecosystems in a very kind of constructive and proactive way, which I think is different. I mean, a lot of people kind of fall into ecosystems by accident, or if they think about them at all, they think, oh, I've got to be the platform that everybody else is using. They don't really think about how ecosystems are constructed. But I thought before we get to the right game, let's start off with Wide Lens. And that when did that come out?
2012.
2012. So it's had a little bit to marinate now. And what was the big idea in Wide Lens? Maybe if you describe that for people.
Yeah, well, so Wide Lens, what successful innovators see that others miss, was really kind of trying to establish the idea that when we innovate, Wide Lens was more about strategy for innovation. It's critical that we have a way, not just the need, but a way to look beyond execution, beyond the stuff that we've always been told is how you get success, right? That you need to have a great idea, that you need to deliver on that idea that matters to your customer, and that you need to beat your competition. You need to have a competitive advantage. That was bread and butter strategy stuff. And for decades, the promise that was made was if you can do these three impossible things, right? Come up with an idea your customer wants, deliver it, have competitive advantage, that's how you win. And Wide Lens was really about saying, well, great execution is always necessary, but there are areas where it is no longer sufficient. That's when your success depends on these interactions and, the quote unquote ecosystem. And the two pillars that widen the lens were the notion of co-innovation, which is as you're innovating, how do you think about other people who need to innovate for your innovation to matter? And your adoption chain, which is besides your end customer and who needs to buy in for you to deliver not your product or service, but your value proposition. Mm-hmm. And that was really surfacing the actors who are critical to your success, but not necessarily on your critical path. And that's how you begin to put structure on this fuzzy notion of an ecosystem.
And it's really, I think so many of the winning companies today, I can't think of one big company that operates independent of an ecosystem. And I mean, it's a very different notion than the notion of a value chain, which that's what we grew up with in strategy, right? You broke the value chain down, and that's how you understood what a company was doing. And yet, an iPhone without an app store is kind of useless, and so forth. So I think it's a big move forward in terms of how we understand success and lack of success in strategy. And so the winning the right game. And I'd love you to start off with the story that you tell at the beginning of the book about Kodak, because there's this sort of myth about Kodak that turns out, when you really look at it through the lens you're using in the book, not to be so accurate.
Yeah. So, by the way, the first chapter of the book is available. It's posted on ronadner.com, so that's everybody can read this.
Oh, great.
The starting point for this book was, so the title "Winning the Right Game" is supposed to evoke a number of different things. Right? and the first thing it's supposed to evoke is the possibility of winning the wrong game, mm-hmm. which is which is new, right? And in some ways, that's the transition from an industry-based perspective, where you have a clear sense of who your competitors are, you know what the race you're running is, and if you look at your place and you know whether you've won or lost. Winning the right game is the strategy challenge in a world of ecosystems where suddenly what you realize there are other actors in your vicinity who are interacting with you, who are affecting your ability to create value, but maybe playing a very different game than you. And so the kickoff for this book is supposed to really be kind of a shock, like to demonstrate to the reader that, wow, there is some fundamental stuff that don't delude yourself that you understand about strategy and how it's changed. So I start with the story of Kodak, which is, in some ways, I felt like the biggest bet in the book, right? To start with as soon as I say Kodak, everybody's like, yeah, we know it, right? Everyone's heard the story of Kodak 100 times. And they've all been told, turns out, 100% the wrong story, right? So the standard story of Kodak is they invent digital technology, but they're too inert within their organization, whether it's bad management or just not having the capabilities, et cetera. They can't adapt, they won't adapt. And so it's because of that they get trapped in this analog world and lose out in the digital future, and they go bankrupt. And so the lesson that is taught from there is, oh, well, you and your organization should be bigger risk takers, et cetera. And for 10 years, that's what people have been diagnosing and pontificating. Now, it turns out that story is 100% false. And what's important, though, is not that it was not the true Kodak story, which I'll tell in a minute, but it's reflecting on how could we have been so wrong for so long, and what does that mean about the way in which we understand or misunderstand modern strategy. Mm-hmm. So the real Kodak story is that starting in 2000, they actually make an incredible push into digital. They're incredibly successful at it. They become the #1 seller of digital cameras in the country. They become a prime contender in digital printing. They make this big bet. They look at HP and they're like, wow, you know what? Analog versus digital, we have common technologies that we've developed internally. There's a huge amount of money to be made in digital printing. And they bet the farm on digital printing, and they succeed. But just
their CEO came over from HP. I mean, I think that's important to know as well. So he was already kind of primed to see the world through printer lenses.
Right. So, but everybody was saying that it wasn't just him, right? The analysts, consultants they brought in, everybody was saying this is going to be impossible for you guys to do. But if you do, that's what success looks like. And what happens is that they do succeed in becoming an important player in digital printing. But digital printing itself gets impacted by digital viewing, right? So, when was the last time that you printed a photo? So Kodak made this big bet in being the best digital photo printing company in the world, and they succeeded, but printing photos became a very rare event. And so this is what it means to win, but to win the wrong game, mm-hmm. Right? And so kind of from a strategist perspective, what it means is you can't just say, oh, we need better transformation capability. You need to recognize what is relevant versus irrelevant transformation. Mm-hmm. And so the point of this is to step back and ask, well, okay, so that's the story. How did we get it so wrong for so long? And because as soon as you say screens, the answer is, oh yeah, of course, now I get it. Let's move on. But that's understanding a story that is irrelevant to every listener, right? I mean, maybe there's a personal history there, but it doesn't teach you how to look at your environment and make sure that you don't fall victim to that. And that's really the heart of, the tool set that I've tried to put together in this book, mm-hmm. is what is the way we need to look at the environment to make sure that we're not blindsided by this different kind of disruption, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. So that's the point of the Kodak story is to say, in a world of ecosystems, we need to be able to understand dynamics that go across. So essentially what I talk about is a kind of cross box versus inside the box disruption. Right. Classic disruption, what we learned from Clay's great work was all about, there's a substitute threat. And if it starts worse but gets good enough and you miss it, it'll kill you. Mm-hmm. That was do you really want to do digital printing versus analog printing? Do you want digital photography versus analog photography? This is a different kind of disruption, which is printing's going to go away. How do you see the screen as a substitute for a printer? Mm-hmm. And how do you prepare yourself for that kind of environment?
Well, and I think Clay said that I remember him talking about this back in the day. He said, people didn't change the job to be done because digital photography came along. What you wanted to do was capture a moment, and as you say in the book, a Kodak moment. They owned that phrase, right? You wanted to capture a moment. You want to be able to store it somehow. You want to be able to then look at it later. And he said, with physical pictures, what happened? You took a photo. You had to go somewhere to get it developed, unless you had Polaroids. And then you got your prints back. And what did you do? You showed them to people for a little bit, and then you put them in a box.
Right.
You do
and
the
with
same
digital
thing with your phone.
photos,
Sorry?
but with digital photos, you did the same thing, except you had a printer at home. Right. And then this really interesting dynamic took place, right, which is kind of the other big aha in chapter 1, is this what I talk about in terms of value inversion. Mm-hmm. Right. So in the classic world, what you worry about is substitutes. Right. Substitutes, they always start off, they're always bad news because they get better and better. You're more and more worried. Digital is getting better. That's bad news for analog. What's interesting in this story is that the screen improvements in the beginning were really good for printer makers, right? If you put a screen on the back of a camera, now people can take better pictures. As all that gets better, initially, right, the trajectory is positive. But then the screen, as it gets sufficiently cheap, sufficiently ubiquitous, sufficiently high quality, it becomes too good, right? This is the contrast to the substitute of, the good enough threat from a substitute. This is a too good threat that emerges from a complement, right? And this is how partners turn into rivals. And this is this is kind of in the background of so much interaction in ecosystems, is this notion of, well, we need to work together. But how do I think about the future, right? And this is this notion of co-opetition obviously has been around since the early 90s. Mm-hmm. But what's been missing is the structure of, well, how do you think about these dynamics, right? And what's critical is that this dynamic is not the bargaining power story that we had from Brandenburger and Nailbuff. Commoditization. This is the fundamental value creation that you have being undermined by what's happening in your environment. Mm-hmm. Hold on, I'm just going to close this curtain. Myself being divided by the
They have sunshine up in Hanover.
Oh, we do. It's glorious.
Oh, that's nice. It's a nice time of year to be up there.
Yeah.
So the company that you use as the contrast case to Kodak is Lexmark. And I think it might be interesting to take a look at them. And then I'm going to ask you to talk about, just so you get your short-term memory going, about the cases of Spotify and TomTom, because I think those are really interesting. I think you call them ecosystem defense stories. Mm-hmm. But start off with Lexmark.
So the natural response to this is, well, but can you see it coming, right? And this is the question that is always very legitimately posed to anyone talking about strategy. It's like, oh, well, that's retrospective.
I get it all the time.
And is it really reasonable to think that you can see this stuff in advance? And, well, first of all, that's why you develop frameworks, right? Rather than just tell stories. And what's interesting, so kind of the frameworks, I think, actually used with clients prospectively quite successfully. But what's great about the story of Kodak is there's a demonstration case, which is Lexmark, which was a digital printing company, focused more on documents than photos. Their CEO in 2009, right, as Kodak CEO, was tripling down on his printer bet. In their annual report says, hey, you know what? We're looking around, and screens are substituting for printing. And what he did was he then took action. Right? So it's not that Kodak was in any position to stop the development of screens, nor was Lexmark. But what Lexmark's CEO did was he weaned them off of printing. And while their share price was still high, started buying software companies and said, we're going to move into not document printing so much as document management. And ends up with a very successful growth path for the next 5 years before they're acquired by private equity, for twice the price that, for twice the valuation as when he made that announcement that printing was going away. Right. So you can, even if you can't stop the tide from coming in, you can move to a different point on the beach. Right. And so, and the way, in the absence of, clear logics and frameworks, what we depend on is, great leaders with great intuition. I think great leaders with great intuition do even better when they have frameworks that actually, importantly, it's not so much that they'll necessarily change the intuition, although they should, but it makes it easier to communicate the intuition, right? Especially when that intuition is non-intuitive.
Right. Well, and our mutual friend Phil Rosenzweig talks about the halo effect, right? Which I think just scan the shelf of any set of business books on the planet, right? And I'd say half of them suffer from this. And this is the you infer genius because the outcomes were good, and you infer negligence or stupidity or whatever if the outcomes are bad. And the problem is, in real life, you never know. You can have a wonderful, I've seen this, you can have a wonderful, skillfully developed, really solid process, and you're a travel company in December of 2019. I'm sorry, no amount of good strategy is going to save you in the event of something like that. And I've also seen cases where you can have a horrible, toxic, messed up, just ridiculous process, and you have great success because you happen to be standing in the right place at the right time. You say this in the book, right? If you've got a choice between luck and strategy, pick luck.
Right. But since no one gives you that choice,
strategy is kind of the next best thing.
Yeah, well, better strategy reduces your dependence on good luck, or increases your resilience against bad luck. It doesn't offset it entirely.
Well, I think strategy, when it's done right, it's pulling you into the future, and it's giving you not a point destination. It's giving you a range of possible destinations against a clear set of guardrails. That's how I think about it anyway. So it helps you be much better prepared and much closer to the phenomenon, I think. Absolutely.
Right. We love it. There's the famous Eisenhower's quote, right, which is, plans are nothing, but planning is everything.
Yeah, right.
Right. And the meaning of that is that we know reality will differ from the plan, but if you have a plan, at least you know which way it's veered towards, so you know which way to adjust.
Yeah, exactly.
And I would
so our friend Bogdan wants to know about competition coming from partners and how you define an ecosystem. And in the book, you make the point that most of these value inversion stories are partnership stories to some extent.
Yeah. So it starts with how you define an ecosystem, right? Which is, as I say in the book, ecosystem now is, as pervasive and practically meaningless a word as innovation, disruption, et cetera. Right. And kind of the litmus test I'll give is 98% of conversations that you hear, I think if you take out the word ecosystem and you put in the word mishmash, there'd be no meaning lost in the sentence. And kind of what that means, by the way, is it means, first of all, people are really sensitive to the fact that there is all this interaction and interdependence. That's why they use the term so much. But it also means that beyond that, they don't have much to structure it around. So when I talk about ecosystems, I have a very clear definition, which again starts in chapter 1, which is the ecosystem is the structure through which partners interact to deliver a value proposition to an end consumer. And that does a number of different things. The first thing, it anchors the notion of an ecosystem, a value proposition, rather than in a given firm. It highlights the importance of understanding, where it is that you need to worry about multiple partners simultaneously. And where is it that you can take a set of interactions, like an industry supply chain, which has a lot of interdependence, but you can deal with it just at a dyadic level. You just look at a buyer, supplier, and you know everything you need to know about the system. Then you don't need to worry about ecosystems. But in a multilateral interdependent setting, you have to worry about it. And in some ways, the anchoring of the book is, in that kind of world, the way you approach strategy has to be different. Mm-hmm. And the book is an attempt at showing what's the right way to approach, right? Rather than just making that announcement, the deliverables are, here are the frameworks that help us think through strategy in this world. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Great. So you talk about ecosystem defense. So you're tootling along in your ecosystem in your TomTom, or your Spotify or something. And a competitor who was also a collaborator at one point does something to undermine you. Maybe take the Spotify story, which I think would be quite interesting.
So, we're so used to thinking, when we talk about ecosystems, we point to the big obvious winners, like to Google and Facebook and Amazon. And so the second chapter of the book, is about ecosystem defense, which is to say, well, let's assume you're not them. Let's assume you're on the other side, right? And so there's the example about, Wayfair selling furniture online, and then Amazon comes in and says, we're gonna make furniture the number one category for our priorities. So how does a company like Wayfair not die in that headlong attack from this giant, right? And Spotify, same thing. Like, how is Spotify still successful despite the fact that when Apple launched Apple Music, this is Apple, at the height of its power with the biggest product launch in its history? And the answer is, well, if you're facing an ecosystem offense, what you need is an ecosystem defense. And an ecosystem defense is collective. It relies on assembling partners into a coalition to help offset this attack, because what makes these ecosystem disruptors different, particularly the large incumbents, is that they're coming in with a broader panoply of activities and offers in the market. And so if you're trying to go head to head against them, it's probably a big mistake. But if you look around, you might be able to see a way of building a new coalition or reinforcing an existing alliance to help you survive or possibly thrive in the aftermath of this attack. And with the Spotify case, kind of the interesting aha is that, well, so what is it that allows Spotify to deal with this attack of Apple? First of all, you still have to do a great job at execution, right? So Spotify has to be innovative, has to have a great product, et cetera. But we know of a lot of companies that had great products that fell and succumbed to these attacks. A key part of Spotify's defense was the fact that a critical partner, the music companies, were desperate to find an alternative to Apple's leadership in the retailing of digital music, right? I mean, the whole, as I say, the second worst thing that happened to the music industry was Napster and the rise of piracy. The first worst thing was the agreement to sell songs at 99 cents a song, right? Which was the music industry saying, we used to make $15 off of 2 good songs, and I force you to digest an album, right? They signed up for 99 cents a song, and Apple wouldn't let them get out of it. And so music
and they
industry,
could get away with it, as you point out in the book. Apple, there was no other alternative.
Right. And so the music companies were eager to find an offset to Apple. Now, it took Spotify some time to figure out how to do that with them, et cetera. And then the interesting twist at the end of that case is that part of what happens when you have a collective defense is that you have to respect your coalition, right? And kind of where Spotify almost loses it, but then retreats correctly, is when they start talking about how their next stage of growth is going to be, well, we have direct access to listeners. You don't really need these gatekeepers that are traditional music labels. And they announced this, on a weekday morning, and there's this FT headline. It's like, it's going to be Spotify's going to make all this money, and by that evening, in an industry music industry journal, the headline is, the music companies are not going to give Spotify the license to sell in India. Right. And then within a couple of months, Spotify, well, quite before that, Spotify comes in, oh, no, you misunderstood. We will never be in the content business. Right. Recognizing that if they can't hold together this coalition, all kinds of other bad things will happen. Mm-hmm. So an ecosystem setting means that you have to discipline your growth ambitions in a way that respects the volition of your coalition partners.
Mm-hmm. I love that story. The other one I think is really fun is the TomTom story. And this is one of the fascinating things with the evolution of smartphones, is that you're making a gadget that has maps on it, or you're making a thing that takes pictures, or you're making a whatever, and this one device is just sort of engulfed and devoured all of those little categories. But TomTom actually figured out a path to some kind of viability through that.
Yeah, right. Look, it's a miracle. How is TomTom still a billion-dollar company with interesting prospects for really big growth, right? And so what TomTom, again, I invite viewers and listeners to check out the story. But for TomTom, the big question was, how do we find people who are just as wary of Google's incursion into our market, that they're worried that Google will go into their markets? And essentially, TomTom positions themselves as not Google, and in that way are able to, find a pretty impressive set of enterprise customers, that even as their B2C market disintegrates, right, as Google Maps is free on the phone that you happen to have in your pocket,
And Apple as well.
And Apple as well, right? And so so that's the notion of playing in an ecosystem. There's a new set of rules and a new set of frameworks for thinking about offense, but just as critical, and probably more critical in terms of the number of firms impacted, is how do you defend when these kinds of actors come in? And it's interesting. Defense is not a term we usually think about in strategy.
Right? Or if we do, it's negative. It's negative. Like being on the defense is never seen as good.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a new toolbook.
I like that. I like that a lot. But there's also offense, and how do you build this? And I think the story of Amazon and Alexa is really interesting, and I find it fascinating on a couple of dimensions. Firstly, that Amazon swung for the fences with their Fire Phone effort. Like sometime back, I guess Jeff Bezos decided he wanted to be the second coming, of Steve Jobs or something. And it was a disaster. I mean, nobody bought the thing. And so I would argue that was a case where they had not really thought about their ecosystem very much. But the apocryphal story I heard, and I don't know if this is true, but what I was told was, out of the disaster that was the Fire Phone was this voice recognition feature that came to Bezos' attention, and he said, "Oh, that could be a thing."
So interesting. Actually, Amazon files with Bezos on the patent, a provisional patent for voice transactions as early as 2006.
Really?
Yeah. So this is, it's really interesting, right? So there's always this question of, well, how can you really plan this stuff? The world is so complicated. Is there really, can anyone really have that kind of vision? And the answer is yes, of course. And if you want to do something complicated, it's essential that you have a long-term vision to build on, rather than this notion of, incremental adaptation, pivot here, pivot there. This notion of pivot itself is like, every time somebody says pivot, a founder loses equity. Right? I mean, that's like my.
That's a great quote. One of your fans on the chat here was asking for what's the next Adner quote.
It's that, I think, is like, the need for strategy is massively amplified in the context of an ecosystem, because not only you're trying to do something more complicated, you're trying to do it with partners whose faith in you it's a miracle that they trusted you to begin with. But if you start screwing around, the likelihood that they stick around diminishes very quickly. So so there's a swing for the fence, but there's also like it's like the Babe Ruth moment of pointing to where you're going to go, and then having the discipline and the confidence to commit to the journey, right? And part of what's the framework that remember, like these case studies are interesting, but they're not actionable, right? They're there to illustrate a logic and a set of frameworks that actually can be applied in real time within a real organization. And the key principle that the Alexa case illustrates is how you start off with a minimum viable ecosystem, and then think about the order in which you're going to add partners and enhance your value proposition. And the trap that people fall into when they talk about ecosystems, and usually think that ecosystem and platform are synonymous, is they always envision like, all right, so when I have the platform, then how do I win? It's like, yeah, if you're born rich, there's a question of how you invest your money. But the question for most of us is, well, how do you get there, right? How do you construct that position in the ecosystem? And that's, in some ways, that's the heart of ecosystem offense, is ecosystem construction. Mm-hmm. How do you build that alignment structure? And again, there's a set of principles and concepts and frameworks that I think are quite robust that, will hopefully help people who are trying to work in these contexts.
Mm-hmm. So the whole kind of Alexa thing starts out as a bad speaker, basically.
Yeah. So all right. So the Amazon, a late mover into the smart assistant space. Like, who are they behind? They're behind Apple. they're behind Google, they're behind Microsoft. And just to be clear, between Apple and Google is 100% of the smartphone market, and between Apple and Microsoft is 100% of the desktop market. And here comes Amazon in 2014, long before people are thinking of them as a tech firm. Right, they're the company who's selling you, toilet paper through the mail, comes out in the wake of this massive Fire Phone disaster and puts out this Echo speaker with the Alexa intelligence, which in the beginning, Alexa is not very intelligent. And the speaker is a very mediocre speaker. But the great thing about this is Amazon knows this, right? So, I have these quotes from reviews saying, oh, what a terrible thing this is. But there's no surprise there. Like when there was internal debate within Amazon, do we put out a great speaker for $200? And the insistence was, no, it has to be $99. And they said, well, but then it would be a crappy speaker. And the decision was, then that's what you're putting in the market. Because what the speaker was there to do was to get things started, to start attracting people to the phases are the speaker comes out with Prime music. And
it's only to Prime members. You can't, like an ordinary person who doesn't have Prime membership can't buy it.
It's only sold to Prime members. And by the way, there's something very beautiful in the coherence of that strategy, right? So Prime Music is a second-rate streaming music service. And Amazon is putting out a second-rate speaker. By the way, they signed the deal for Prime Music 6 months before the launch of the Echo. Right? I'm going to suggest to you that was not accidental. So what they put out there is a speaker that's supposed to basically be like a noisemaker on your kitchen counter, right? It's not for the audiophile. And it has some basic features. The next thing they do is they add apps, essentially, right? Their voice skills to the Echo, and these are stupid skills. So it's like horoscope and magic 8-ball. But the point of it was not to make the users better off. It was to demonstrate to developers that this is actually a platform you can develop for. And it's only after they put out these Skills 2.0 that they open up to external developers and make the developer kit available, right? And then it's step by step that they create this position, right? Which, by the way, is like in that regard, they followed the iPhone strategy, right? So Apple launched the iPhone. It's only a year and a half later that they opened up the App Store, right? And that leads to a very different dynamic than if you're relying on these partners from day one,
right?
To just trust you.
Yeah. Something I always say about Apple that we've completely forgotten now. Like if you time travel all the way back to 2007, Apple had a pretty poor product from the point of view of security, even from the point of view of being able to type well on it. I mean, even to this day, I make more typos on that model than any others. And they were chained at the hip to the worst network for 2 years. And it was things like, I remember there was some complaint about, well, if you held it a certain way, like the
That's
phone
right.
wouldn't transmit.
Yeah,
and Jobs' response was, well, don't hold it that way.
Right.
It was sort of flew in the face of every notion of strategy. But what I try to tell people is like where you start is not where you're traveling to. And so we do all this analysis with this new thing, and then we put it on a shelf and we don't go back to it and say, how are they evolving?
Well, so, I would direct people to chapter 8 of the Wide Lens, which is, an analysis of how Apple got to be Apple. And the really interesting thing about the iPhone, right, which again, consistent with this notion of an MVE and carryover, is the iPhone starts off as the next generation iPod that comes with a phone. And by the way, the phone was optional. Right? They launched the iPad, the iPod Touch. And if you wanted, you could get a Touch with a crappy phone. Or you could get an iPod Touch and keep using your Motorola phone. It's totally up to you. But it was that allowed them entry into this totally different industry. And what's interesting about it is, today, right? So this is like the notion of ecosystem disruption. Kind of the Alexa story is a beautiful illustration of it. Is, for Alexa, there used to be 3 different industries. There used to be an industry for smart home hubs, and incumbents were trying to play in there. Philips, Johnson Controls, Microsoft, Apple, etc. There was a different market for speakers, and there was a different market for smart assistants. And what Alexa did was it collapsed those three into this new thing. So if I came to you today and said, oh, I want funding for a smart home hub that is only a smart home hub, you'd be like, that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Right? Just like with the iPhone, right? We used to have a market for MP3 players, very competitive. And we used to have a market for phones, smartphones, very competitive. And then it was combined into this new thing, and those two industries disappeared essentially as standalone entities. That was another example of an ecosystem disruption, right? And making a better MP3 player was not going to protect you from this kind of disruption.
Absolutely right. And so I derailed you on the Alexa story, because the one I think is so fascinating is how they came to be like spec'd into other people's products.
Yeah, right. So they open up to developers. And then once they have the developers in place, and again, there's a clear time lag, there's a clear strategy here. It's only then that they open up APIs that allow Alexa to interact with other people's hardware, right? And so essentially they're going to the companies that were trying to be smart home hubs and saying, hey, I'm sure your hubs are wonderful, your products are great. No one's buying them. I don't know why, but if you'd like, since you have these devices, you can have them interact with our platform. And so in this fourth phase, what happens is you could now talk to your Echo speaker and have it control the lights. And then the next stage after that, which was really the hope from the very beginning, was they launched Alexa Inside, which was now you don't need the Echo speaker. For $7, you can buy a chipset and put it into the light switch, so you can talk, the user can talk to the light switch rather than the speaker, and speaking into the speaker to speak to the light switch. And it's through this mode that they really, out of nowhere, think about how unlikely it is that they become the lead player in this whole new world of ambient computing, right? Voice-based controls that are now being placed into cars. They're trying to move into healthcare, into enterprise. And the point of this is not so much like, wow, how do you have that vision? The way you have that vision is you watch Star Trek in 1960. and the notion of being able to speak to a computer and have it control your environment, that's, Hollywood has spent billions of dollars showing the use case for that. The question is, how do you build your way there? And that's, right, so again, you can't confuse vision and strategy. And strategy in an ecosystem is how do you bring the pieces together to get to that vision? The vision is not as unique as we tend to think it is.
Absolutely. Oh, I mean, whenever I talk about autonomous vehicles, 1962, the Jetsons,
Exactly.
They did everything, right? It just took a while for the technology to catch up. So one of the points that you also make, which I think is super interesting, is that it's a chapter you call the ecosystem, which is, everybody wants to be number one, everybody wants to own the thing. And it can actually stymie the formation of an ecosystem, which, this is almost like one of those prisoner's dilemma choices you have to make as a strategist, because, if you give up your leadership position, you might see a thriving ecosystem flourish, but there's no guarantee it's going to be good for you. But if you try to keep your leadership position, nobody else wants to play ball. And, it reminds me of back in the day, and you use Citigroup as one of the example companies, but back in the day, right, Citigroup did this enormously ambitious venture to create what we now know as automatic teller machines, or ATMs. And then they made the decision that they weren't going to play nice with anybody. So it had such a powerful impact on their market share and their penetration when they first introduced these things that they said, we're going to keep it all to ourselves. And so what do all the other banks do? They band together into a situation where if you used, at the time it would have been, Chase Manhattan Bank or one of those banks that has now kind of disappeared from the face of the planet, but you could go to any of their banks and use the machine. And so Citibank had this enormous advantage that because they didn't play nicely with others, got turned into a disadvantage. And they actually had to reverse course very dramatically to be able to use the interchangeable technology that the other banks used. So I've always thought that was a really interesting ecosystem selfishness story.
Well, so it is, but at the same time, right? You listen to it, and you're like, yes, but that was a game that was played entirely within an industry, right? That was Citibank thinking about Chase and it's a rival. What do I want to do with it? Mobile payments it's Apple versus Google. There are banks involved. The retailers are setting up their own payment network. And so the game that's being played and the parties that are being relied on are so much more diverse today, right? And so the upside of the promise is, but if you get it right, your gains can be enormous. You're defining truly new market space. And at the same time, it's so much easier to get it wrong. And the notion of the ecosystem trap is, so an ecosystem trap is what happens when you define your ecosystem around yourself, right? When your default assumption is, I'm at the center of my ecosystem. This is, what's interesting is there are very few large successful ecosystem players who have not succumbed to the ecosystem trap, right? I think Amazon is actually quite distinct in that they're really clear about when they're expanding within an ecosystem and when they're moving into a new one, right? And the leading case study in that the ecosystem chapter is about Apple, which is enormously successful in its home ecosystem, which is devices that let you access data, remote and in a mobile way. That's the expansion from the iPod to the iPhone to the iPad to the watch, whatever the accessories are. But they have been massively underperforming in every other, if we define an ecosystem according to a value proposition, in payments, in health, in education, in publishing, in video, the list goes on and on. And you could say the same thing, by the way, about Google, the same thing about, Microsoft for quite a long time, the same thing about Facebook, their inability to move into new ecosystems. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that if you don't have a clear sense of what is an ecosystem, you have no possible way of knowing when you're moving from one ecosystem to the next, when it is that you need to reestablish your leadership or revisit your role more appropriately, right? You could be a leader, you could be a follower. In an industry, being a follower is always a dirty word, right? It's like, oh, you never want to be a follower. In an ecosystem, if you don't have followers, you don't have a successful ecosystem. And in an ecosystem, a successful ecosystem is one where everybody wins. Mm-hmm. So followers win in an ecosystem. And there's a whole back half discussion in that chapter 5 about what does it mean to be a smart follower in an ecosystem. And smart followers can have returns that are incredibly attractive, because even if their absolute profit is not as high, the investment they make is so much lower than someone trying to be an ecosystem leader. The returns can be enormous and the risks are a lot lower. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't mean you should always be one or the other, but you should be aware of your menu of strategic choices, mm-hmm. rather than always default.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fascinating. So among the stories that should not have gone as badly as they did is General Electric's Predix system, which was meant to be, right, GE. And I was working with them for many years, but GE was going to no longer a hardware company. We're going to be a software company. We're going to be the platform for the Internet of Things. And it kind of didn't work out. and I think you do a nice job of sort of illustrating some of the mistakes that they made in trying to get this ecosystem built around their technology, aside from the fact that technology wasn't that great to begin with.
But again, we have lots of success with mediocre technology, yeah, with great alignment.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's and there are a lot of I look at it probably as many failures as I do successes. Mm-hmm. But again, the point is to use these examples to demonstrate the general principles, right? And the interesting nuance. So there's the usual ecosystem story that comes with GE, but the interesting nuance that came up with Predix, and this is like a flag to wave at large incumbents that are trying to play this game, is when GE thought that they had this big advantage for jumpstarting Predix as like the operating system for the Internet of Things, because they had great internal customers within the company. Mm-hmm. But they essentially having those internal customers skewed their sense of what's interesting and what's possible in the broader market. Mm-hmm. Right. And so the way in which you want to govern initiatives that hope to create ecosystem positions, in some ways, Predix is a great example of why it is that you need to be thinking way up front, mm-hmm. about how you want to structure them. right? This is definitely, by the way, not a call to say, oh, they need to be separate from the organization and isolated, et cetera, right? I have a strong argument against that, but it's, you need to understand when it is that you're in a, so GE, right? So, Jack Welch, who ran GE and was regarded as, one of the greatest CEOs of the 20th century. He had a book called Winning,
Mhm.
right? And in some ways, that's the title of this book plays off a little bit of that.
Mhm.
I said with Welch, that was true. Like, you want to be a GE, you needed to win, and it was that simple, right? How do you win? You're number one or number two in your industry. Well, how do you do that? You reduce costs, you increase quality, you do both, and that's how you win in an industry. And that's all true, by the way. All that industry stuff that we've been teaching for decades is correct in the context of industries.
Right.
In the context of an ecosystem, everything changes, right? And so, you need to know when you're crossing into this new boundary, and that's when you apply these new tools. You also need to know when you're not crossing into this new boundary, in which case you're better off playing by the old rules rather than adding all this strategic infrastructure if it's not really needed.
Well, I think what digital has done has made operating with the old rules a lot less tenable. I mean, if I just take the couple of cases, right? So, and I had a chat with Ray Wong about this, and he says, what these he calls them digital networks, digitally driven data networks, DDDNs. And he says what they do is they get in between you and your end customer. And then they use their data analytic power to kind of make you almost irrelevant. And his canonical example there would be the small restaurants versus the food delivery companies. So these small restaurants don't have the resources to develop their own apps and that kind of thing. So they say, sure, I'll go with Uber Eats or DoorDash or whoever. But essentially what's now happened is, first of all, they've put the restaurant in competition with every other restaurant on the platform. Because before that, if you had to go to the physical restaurant, maybe you'd be looking at a 10-mile radius, but you wouldn't be looking at, at every single possibility. You decide tonight's Italian and off you go. And secondly, that they've got all this information about customers, which restaurants were never able to get before. So, just a really interesting picture to me of this kind of intermediary shoving out some of these systems.
Yeah, and I think, so actually I have a paper with Marvin Lieberman called Disruption Through Compliments. That is, I should have sent you a link to share.
There you go.
It's an open source article, Disruption Through Compliments. And this is one of the examples that we discussed there. So what's interesting there is that, so this is a perfect example of value inversion. Because in the beginning, these delivery platforms,
it was great, more business.
Complementers.
More
right?
business.
But what happened over time is that they got, too good, too powerful. And now suddenly the complementer, the better they get, the worse off you are. Right. And so, so you always, you want to play back the tape and say, well, what could they have, if they had seen this coming, what could they have done? And
Ray's answer is the Domino's, and it could be delivered by Domino's.
Right. They could have looked for a better set of leaders, right? Leaders that are more aligned with restaurants. And so and again, it's not that they could somehow that a restaurant can become a tech firm, but you need to have an ecosystem strategy to know who, not just what you want to accomplish, but who you want to rely on, right? How do you pick the right ecosystem leader, and how do you make sure they stay right for the long term rather than, now that you're on the hook, I'm going to drag you down. Value inversion.
Yeah. So I have a quick GE funny story. And then I would love you to comment on leadership, because I think that's one of the more kind of counterintuitive things about the book. So at GE, this is years ago, I was teaching discovery-driven planning, which is a planning methodology that sort of acknowledges you don't know what you're doing, but you can make intelligent hypotheses and take one step at a time. And so I'm going through this with a whole room full of I was in the pit, at Crotonville, which is their big training facility. And some guy gets up, and I think he was with the oil and gas business or something. He says, Rita. I said, yes. He says, you don't understand. At General Electric, we don't plan to learn. We plan to win. I was like, good luck with that, dude. For those of you that don't know what Predex is, it just occurs to me I didn't explain it. It was General Electric's system for making inanimate objects intelligent by putting sensors on them and then connecting them with all kinds of sort of sensing and intelligence devices, turning physical things into much more digital offerings. So just in case anybody doesn't know what that was. So let's talk about leadership, because I think the Microsoft story is absolutely fascinating. And it's another, what I love about this book is that there's all these places where you're like, well, here's the conventional wisdom, right? Steve Ballmer was an idiot. Satya Nadella is, descended from heaven. And yet you say, well, wait a minute. If you look at it through the frameworks in the book, you'd come to a different conclusion. And you talk about ecosystem. What kind of leadership is necessary at different phases of an ecosystem's development?
Yes, so I start the chapter by saying, usually strategy people don't talk about leadership because we don't usually have a lot to say, right? Like the good advice is get a better leader, right? Which is not particularly helpful. But as I was working through, so this book was basically it was a project that started as soon as Wide Lens ended. And so for me, it's been a kind of a journey of discovery. And working through this, I had this. So I knew I wanted to think about Nadella versus Balmer at Microsoft, and it was really clear that Nadella was doing things differently than Balmer did. And my initial thinking was to say, well, clearly Nadella's an ecosystem CEO and Balmer wasn't. But you step back and you look at Microsoft under Balmer, and you look at all the relationships that they had, and you look at all the interdependence, you're like, wait a minute, you can't say that wasn't an ecosystem, right? There was something else going on. And you scratch the surface a little bit more, and you think about the critiques of Microsoft under Balmer, which is they missed all this stuff. They missed smartphones, they missed tablets, they missed so many different things. And you say, well, it's because they were so focused on themselves, and the usual attribution is, the CEO is not visionary, the CEO is not a risk taker. Then you step back and you actually look at what Balmer did, right? Balmer made massive bets, massive, $10 billion at a time. Right? I see smartphones, I'll buy Nokia, right? That was like their fourth effort at smartphones after their, Windows Mobile, Windows CE, et cetera.
Oh, and don't leave out the kin phone.
That's right. Right.
Everybody's forgotten about that one by now.
He invested tens of billions in the cloud, Azure. He made all these investments. He saw all the right things, and none of them came to fruition. And so kind of what's fascinating is when you look at what Microsoft is known for today, all the success under Nadella, quite frankly, all those investments had been made under Balmer. And what's interesting, of course, is Nadella worked directly under Balmer as president of Azure for 3 years. He was in charge of cloud, and cloud went nowhere until he became CEO. And so the aha here is that, so Balmer was great as an execution-focused CEO. No one could squeeze more out of an existing set of relationship than Balmer. What Nadella represents is a different kind of leadership mindset, an alignment mindset. And so the starting aha here is that when you're in ecosystems, it's not that you need better leaders, it's that you need different leaders, right? That there's this inherent tension between an execution mindset and an alignment mindset. And they're in conflict, right? An alignment mindset sacrifices, certainly in the near term, right? When we think about what a great leader is, it's somebody who puts their company first. That was Balmer through and through. However, if you're thinking about aligning partners and you tell them, I put my company first every single time, from a partner perspective, I'm like, well, I'd like to be high on that list as well, right? And so there's this tension between executing and aligning, and the kinds of behaviors, the kinds of traits, the sorts of things that you want to develop, whether it's in yourself or in the leaders that you're picking, have to change depending on where your opportunities are. And I think the implication, as you said earlier, is very, very, less and less of the world today is happily stable in a static setting. And so what we need to be looking for are, people who are developed and developing as alignment mindset folks. And that's the sixth chapter in the book. And critically, then there's also a very strong implication for, so what if you're not the CEO, right? Most of us are somewhere below the CEO, just kind of numerically within an organization. How does that affect the way in which you think about navigating the internal ecosystem within the organization? And that's, again, it's a complementary logic
Yeah.
of interdependence.
So I would be remiss if I didn't bring up someone that I know we both just have a tremendous admiration for, and that's Nancy McKinstry at Wolters Kluwer. So I remember being with her leadership team when she first came into that role. I mean, this was going back to 2003
2003 or 2004.
Something like that, a long time ago. And she was this totally unlikely pick, right? I mean, she's an American for a Dutch company. She's got this background as sort of a consultant, I mean, it was just a very unlikely pick. And I'm told it was a small faction of the board that, after having gone through a series of CEOs who just couldn't make change happen, they said, we need somebody different. And then she was kind of the dark horse that got selected. But the magic she has worked on that company is unbelievable. And in the book, you talk about, it's great to have all these ideas, but being too early is not great. It's almost worse than being too late. And that sometimes there's a need to really pace out what you're doing. And I think she's been masterful at doing that.
Yeah. So she's the CEO of Wolters Kluwer, which is I think a 200-year-old Dutch publishing company. And really it was a company that moved too early into digital publishing. And part of what she managed masterfully was, okay, we're too early. How do we live in this transition? And again, just like the Alexa story, right, had a very clear vision of where she wanted to go, and then built the position incrementally. And is I think it's a remarkable story of successful transformation
that nobody hears of it. People, she's not like on the top of everybody's mind when they think about digital transformation.
That's why they should read this book, Rita.
Sorry?
That's why they should read this book.
Totally. Because all these examples people never
A reason. Yes.
A reason. Well, we're coming up on time. I know people are always going to be curious. If we didn't get to your questions live, we'll copy them and get back to you in a bit. So obviously buy the book. Here it is. Great book. Out not that long ago, right?
Just about a month.
A month. Okay. So brand new. Perfect for the holiday season, just saying. So how do people learn more? You've got your website, ronadner.com, right? And
so ronadner.com, which actually has a lot of kind of helpful resources. Like there's the first chapter of this book and of The Wide Lens, some kind of discussion question ideas. And on there are also links to articles I've written, and there will be a link to this podcast.
There you go.
Great to be with you.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Well, look, thank you for carving out some time by the fireside. It's gotten now cold enough in the Northeast that I can actually have it on. And it's so nice to reconnect. We shouldn't let it be that long between sessions.
Yeah, it was great to see you.
Good to see you. So have a great weekend, everybody. And till next Friday.